Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into one of the biggest mysteries out there, a real cosmic detective story, the origin of life itself. So let's just start with the big one, right? The question that people have been asking for, well, forever. How did life on Earth even begin? And to really get a sense of how big this puzzle is, you gotta look at the timeline. Our planet forms, right, about 4.5 billion years ago. But the very first signs of life, they don't show up for another billion years. So what on earth was happening in that gigantic gap? Okay, so before we can solve this mystery, we kind of have to agree on what we're even looking for. What is life? For scientists, it's not some philosophical idea. It's a very specific checklist. Can it reproduce? Can it grow? And can it process energy from its surroundings to keep itself going? All right, let's rewind the clock way back. We're going to start with humanity's earliest explanations, which, came from faith long before anyone was running experiments. So you had a couple of big ideas. One was special creation, the idea that a supernatural power just created everything. Then you had catastrophism, which was this idea that life was created, then wiped out by some huge disaster, and then a whole new batch of life was created. And look, both of these gave people answers, but the key thing is they're based on supernatural events. You can't really test them in a lab. Okay, so now let's get into the first big idea that actually moved out of pure belief and into something, well, something you could actually investigate. The wild idea that life could just spring up from stuff that wasn't alive at all. And this had a name, spontaneous generation. For hundreds of years, this was the dominant theory. I mean, even the smartest people around believed that if you have the right ingredients, life could just poof, appear out of nowhere. And the evidence for this? It's pretty wild to us now. People saw frogs and snakes seemingly appearing from the mud of the Nile after it flooded. They saw worms wriggling out of horsehairs left in water. And, get this, there were actual recipes. A famous one claimed you could make mice by just leaving a dirty shirt and some wheat in a dark corner. It sounds crazy, but you have to remember, they were just going by what they saw with their own eyes. But here's the thing about science. Just seeing something isn't enough. You have to test it. And that's exactly what happened next. A series of really clever experiments came along and just completely took this idea apart, piece by piece. First up, back in the 1600s, was a guy named Francesco Redi. His experiment was so simple, it was brilliant. He took 3 jars with meat. One was open. Yep, maggots appeared. One was totally sealed. No maggots. But the third one, the genius one, was covered with gauze. Flies landed on the gauze, laid their eggs there, and maggots appeared on the gauze, not on the meat below. The message was unmistakable. Maggots don't come from meat. They come from flies. All right, fast forward 100 years. Lazzaro Spallanzani basically did the same thing, but on a microscopic level. He boiled broth to kill everything in it. If he left the flask open, tiny microorganisms started growing. But if he boiled it and sealed it right away, nothing. It stayed perfectly clear. The takeaway seemed obvious. The tiny living things were coming from the air. But, people weren't ready to give up on the old idea just yet. The critics came back and said, hold on, by sealing the flask, you're not just blocking germs, you're blocking some kind of invisible vital force in the air that's needed to create life. It sounds a little desperate, right? And this is where the story gets its hero, Louis Pasteur. He comes along in 1859 and settles it once and for all with an absolutely brilliant experiment. He designed this special flask with a long S-shaped neck. He boiled his broth, sterilizing it. Now, air could still get in, so the vital force could get in, but any dust or microbes floating in the air would get trapped in the curves of the S-bend. And what happened? The broth stayed perfectly clear. For months. Until Pasteur tilted the flask, let the broth touch the trapped dust, and boom, life exploded in the broth. It was the final nail in the coffin. Pasteur himself said it best. Never will the doctrine of spontaneous generation recover from the mortal blow of this simple experiment. He proved it. Life comes from life. That's it. It's a principle we now call abiogenesis. Okay, so wait a minute. If life only comes from other life, and it can't just spontaneously generate here on Earth, then that opens up a whole new can of worms, doesn't it? It makes you wonder, could it have come from somewhere else? And that brings us to this next idea. The cosmozoic theory, also known as panspermia. The basic concept is that life isn't unique to Earth. It exists all over the universe, maybe as tiny, tough spores just drifting through space. And maybe, just maybe, some of those spores landed on a young Earth billions of years ago and found a nice place to call home. Now, this is a pretty cool idea, right? Especially when scientists found what look like tiny fossils inside meteorites. But there are a couple of huge problems. First, could anything actually survive that incredibly harsh journey through space? And second, and this is the big one, it doesn't actually answer the question. It just kicks the can down the road. It doesn't explain how life started. It just says it started somewhere else. So let's take a breath. At this point in our story, scientists have done a great job of figuring out what isn't the answer. But they still don't know what is. The investigation had hit a bit of a wall. So where do we go now? All right, let's do a quick rundown of the suspects we've looked at so far. Special creation? That's really a question of faith, not something you can prove or disprove with an experiment. Spontaneous generation? Nope, completely debunked by Redi, Spallanzani, and Pasteur. And panspermia, the idea that life came from space? It's a fascinating thought, but there's not much evidence, and like we said, it just pushes the real question off to another planet. Which brings us right back to this huge paradox. Pasteur proved that life only comes from life. So how did the very first life get started? This is the core question that leads us to the modern theory of chemical evolution. The idea that the first life didn't just appear from nothing, but slowly, gradually evolved from complex, non-living chemicals right here on a very different, very primitive Earth. But that's a whole other cosmic detective story for another time.